Hi, I'm Camille with On William Street, and this week we are back to talk all about thread. So when it comes to quilting, and especially finishing the quilt and doing the quilting at the end, I often get asked a lot of times, like, what thread should I use? What color should I use? And it can be very overwhelming because there are literally thousands of different choices when it comes to thread. As you can see here, I have just an array of some assorted thread colors that I personally have in my collection, and this doesn't even touch the tip of the iceberg. So there can definitely be a lot of question going on when you're trying to figure out what thread you should use. So there are a few different things that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to kind of show you some different examples of here when we talk about thread. And the first one is going to be your thread weight. So the way that thread is manufactured and the way that it's calculated is given a thread weight. And what that means is how much length is needed to weigh an industry standard. Don't remember if that's grams or exactly what, but it's the length of the thread that's needed to hit that industry standard. And so you're going to hear the different things like this has a 40 weight or a 50 weight or a 30 weight, or even some threads are a 28 weight or a 100 weight. And basically all that means is that it's going to take 100 inches or whatever the measurement is of that thread to hit that standard weight. So what this means for you is the higher the number, the thinner, the finer the thread is going to be. What we've made here is this is a sample of a lot of different weights, kind of varying from a large weight, a high weight to the low weight. And it just kind of helps you see the difference in the weight in the actual quilting. So here in the middle, I have my 50 and my 40. And most of my quilting is done with one of these two weights. This one's the 50 weight, this one is the 40 weight. So you can see there's just a slight difference. If you look really close here, you can see there's a slight difference in those two in how they look on the thread, but not a huge difference. Then over here, this is actually a 40 weight as well. The difference here is one has a sheen and one is more of a matte. So just kind of give you a visual of how that looks. And then our colored one over here is a 30 weight. And I really don't use 30 weight all that often because I don't want the thread to be that big of a focal point. Going the other direction, however, if you really don't want your thread to show up, these are some great options. So this one is a 60 weight thread, and you can see the difference between the 50 and the 60. It just really starts to disappear into the fabric a little bit more. Obviously with this, I have a dark purple fabric and I'm using mostly white threads, so they do show up a lot more. If you were to put, a matching thread on this, any of these weights is going to disappear a lot more, and when you get into these higher weights, it's really going to sink in and disappear. So keep that in mind. And then of course we have our 100 weight thread, and this is a super fine thread. This one that we've used is Micro Quilter by Superior Threads, and it really, if you're going to quilt with this, after you wash this, you're almost not going to see that thread at all. You're just going to see the texture and what's going on. So if you really don't want your thread to show, this is a really fun one to play with. Just make sure that you play with your tension a little bit because it's such a fine thread. You're going to see very quickly that you're going to have to adjust your tension and make it all work. So this is if you have different thread weights, or you're trying to decide what you like the best, grab a sample and just stitch out some different options so that you can visually see how those different weights are going to affect your quilt. So another thing to take into consideration when you're trying to decide what thread you're going to use is how busy your fabric is. Fabrics that have a lot going on and a lot of prints in them are going to be a lot more forgiving in the choices that you make. So when you're planning a quilt, planning the thread for use on a quilt top that's got a lot of busy fabrics or some very print heavy fabrics, you can see very quickly that the thread starts to be not nearly as important. This, I'm showing you the difference between using a light thread and a dark thread on the same fabric. So over here on the light thread, it still blends into the lighter areas, but even across the darker areas, it doesn't really stand out as much. Over here on the other side, you have the opposite. It's not going to stand out nearly as much on the dark areas, but it's going to stand out a little bit more in the lighter areas. Overall though, by the time you get this washed, you're not going to see those threads all that much at all. But you can start to see the little bit of a difference. If I want it to blend in more, I'm always going to go a shade lighter. In my opinion, it seems to blend a little bit better if I don't have the exact shade. The lighter seems to blend a little bit more than the darker. But again, if you're using a super print heavy quilt, don't stress nearly as much over what thread you're using because it's simply not going to show up all that much. When I have a quilt that has a lot of solids and prints mixed in, that's definitely going to play into my decision on what thread color I'm going to use. If I have a lot of solids, or if I have one background color that's like a definite background for the whole quilt, and it's a solid, I'm most likely going to match my thread to that background because it's going to show up a lot more in all of those background places than it's going to show up on the prints and the different colors throughout the quilt. So unless I want the quilting to really, really stand out and be a super big focal point, using the same color of thread in those background spaces is going to blend into the background. However, I also, I don't like changing thread all that much. I prefer to do it the minimal amount possible, especially because I'm on a long arm. So it's a little bit of a process to change the thread out. So if I'm going to most likely use that same background color on whatever prints and other fabrics that I have. If, however, you're one of those people that really doesn't want your thread to show up all that much, you can definitely go ahead and change it out so that it kind of fits the background element of each of the different fabrics that you're using. So here you're going to see the difference between the solid and the print. So I went ahead and matched the thread to these solid areas, because if I had done it the other way and I'd put, a purple here because it matches this background, that purple is going to stand out so much, and that's not really the look I'm going for. Normally, I don't, when I'm quilting, I want the thread to complement but not stand out. Every once in a while there's a definite design choice and design element there in the color of thread that you use, and that's a whole other discussion. But for the most part, if I want it to blend, I'm going to match it to the solid, because you can see here, even on these purples, where I have this mint green thread, it's not as demanding or overtaking of the print that's in the fabric. Also, on these, I went ahead and did this one in the 60 weight. So this is actually a different color. It's not the green. It's a white 60 weight, but because it's the lower weight, it blends in almost even more than the green does, because it's a finer thread. So that's something, another way to see how that 60 weight is going to actually play in the fabric itself. This is another example of how color plays a part. So up here in the top corner, I've got the white thread going in both directions, and you can see how it plays differently on the white background and the blue background. As you move over here, this one has the white in one direction and the blue in the other direction. This corner is the same, and then you get over here and you can see the blue in both directions. So it really kind of helps you start to see how those threads interact. Obviously, it's blending super well up here in the white. The blue is blending super well down here. But then you can see, okay, do I prefer the blue to stand out on the white more and to blend in with the blue more? Or do I prefer the white to blend in with the white more and the blue over here more? This is something that's really going to come into play if you're doing an all-over design. If I was doing, more of custom quilting on this, and I really didn't want the white to stand out on the blue, it's going to be a lot easier to change thread colors to fill in those blue areas, and then you can match each one. But if you're doing an all-over design that's going to be the same on both, you're going to have to pick what do you want to do, how do you want it to look in the final. So you can start to see some differences here. And this is why I think that making some little samplers is so important. Even if you have the fabrics from the quilt that you're making and you're not quite sure, throw it on a little bit of a scrap of batting, throw a little bit of scrap on the back on it, and just do some squiggles quickly across the different fabrics, and you'll see how it plays. If you don't have the time or don't want to actually stitch it out, even just taking the thread and unspooling quite a bit and draping it over the fabric like this, and you can start to see how that's going to make a difference. So you have the white there, and we can take the same blue and spread it over, and you can really see. We can also go completely crazy, just so you can see how it looks here. But when you're doing this, you definitely want to unspool, a decent amount. Don't put a little tiny bit over there. Put, a foot or so across it. And that kind of helps you start to see how those different fabrics and how those different threads are going to play in the final project. So as you can see, while there are lots of different choices you can make when it comes to thread, once you understand how it works and what effect you want on your quilt and how you want that to look, it definitely becomes a lot easier. You can also definitely go ahead and play with some of these different colors, make up some samples. I have some light green squares that I've done, and I just went ahead and quilted on them with some different colors, and you kind of really learn how the different threads work. I've got my favorite thread is actually called Bone, and it's not a bright white, but it's not really a creamy. It's kind of a real weird purpley creamy light color, but I found that it blends really well with a lot of different colors. So whether it's a solid or a print or whatever's going on, I know that that bone is most likely going to work. Unless, of course, it's a white background. I always use white on white. So how can you put this to use? What does this really mean for you? And I think the best way, like I said, is to go ahead and make some samples and to play with some different thread choices and see what you prefer. When you're trying to decide what to use on a quilt, people ask me, because I don't like to change colors, and I don't mind the thread showing all that much. If you look at some of our quilts, you're going to see that even on a solid red or a solid purple, I've used white because the background is white, and I don't mind the thread showing. I think beginner quilters definitely kind of feel more self-conscious about the thread showing because they don't feel like their quilting is good enough to see it. But people don't really notice it as much as you realize. So don't let that hold you back. Don't let that stop you. If you're making color choices dependent on, you really do want that thread to blend or you don't want it to show, matching is always going to be the best choice. But I really prefer to just pick a nice neutral. If it's a white background, I'm going to use white. If it's a different background, there's an assortment of different creams I'm going to use. If it's a colored background, I'm actually always going to test yellow on it, a light yellow. And you'll be amazed at how many different fabrics that light yellow is really going to blend with. It's not quite as stark as a white, so it doesn't pop quite as much, but it really blends nicely with a lot of things. A light green is also another option. So some things that you might not think about or you might not have considered using, you can test and use that on your quilt top, and it's going to blend really nicely with a lot of different fabrics and a lot of different colors. So in my experience, like I said, the lighter colors definitely kind of blend in a little bit more. The darker colors, unless it is that's a matching fabric, are definitely going to stand out a little bit more. So keep those in mind as those different tips and tricks as you're trying to decide what fabric, what thread you want to use on your quilt and to finish it out. If you do have any other questions on thread or anything specific that we might be able to help with, definitely leave us a comment, shoot us an email. We'll do our best to answer your questions. And as always, make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channels and hit the bell so that you're notified whenever we post a new one. And you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And we will see you next week. Bye.